Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to step outside for a moment, at least in our imagination. Picture this. The street lamps are humming, the neighbours' windows are glowing faintly, and above it all there hangs the moon, crisp and pale like a slice of silver fruit. If you stare at it long enough, you'll feel the strange truth of it. That glowing disc isn't just something to scribble in a notebook or slap on a t-shirt. It has teeth. It pulls on oceans, on ships, on the edges of continents. Without it, you probably won't survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, let me know your location and what time it is where you are. I always find it magical to see how this little chat threads across the globe. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The truth is, I can't look at the moon without feeling it tugging on me too. Maybe not enough to make me float off my chair, though that would save me money on gym memberships. But enough to know that the same force holding me here is busy conducting the oceans like an invisible orchestra. It's gravity, the quiet hand we rarely give credit to. I once heard an old sailor mutter that the sea listens better than people. He meant the tide never ignores the moon's call. Even when storms howl and the water looks wild, there's still that steady background rhythm of in and out, up and down. Old age wisdom. If you want to know whether a harbour is safe, ask not the captain, but the moon. And speaking of oddities, here is a quirky fact you didn't ask for. Astronauts' suits were tested with vacuum cleaners attached to fish tanks. Not elegant, but true. The link? Engineers needed to simulate air pressure differences, and sometimes science really does resemble the backshed of a curious uncle. I like to imagine some poor intern muttering, "We're sending people to space with this?" But back to the point, gravity is democratic. It treats your teacup and an entire ocean with the same affection, only the ocean has more room to show off. The moon's pull isn't loud, but it's patient, and patience wins over distance. You don't hear the oceans complaining. They just obey, bulging slightly on the side nearest the moon, and, strangely enough, bulging again on the opposite side. A lot of people scratch their heads at that. How can water pile up on both sides at once? The academic debate goes like this. Is it gravity alone or the balance with inertia that creates the far side bulge? The answer, boringly enough, is both. To me, it's like watching a slow dance. The earth spins, the moon leans close, and the oceans sigh. That sigh lifts ships, exposes sandbanks, and provides centuries of timing for fishermen who never needed a wristwatch. Somewhere in all that, you and I stand on the shore, maybe barefoot, maybe with a packet of chips, and feel the water creep forward. Then it retreats, leaving a thin line of foam like a signature that the moon has scrawled across the sand. Joke number 2, before I forget. I once told someone tides are caused by giant sea monsters, inhaling and exhaling. They didn't laugh. They nodded thoughtfully and said, "That makes sense. I worry about them." But in seriousness, the moon is a companion that never switches off. It's a reminder that the universe is stitched together not by noise but by pull. Gentle, persistent pull. Each night it hangs above, white and unblinking, tugging at the seas while we pretend we're in control. You don't need to believe in fate to accept gravity. It will have you either way. Sometimes I think of the moon as a slightly mischievous roommate. It doesn't rearrange your furniture, but it does shuffle around the water when you're not paying attention. And when you walk along a shore at dusk, you see the proof. Boats tilted awkwardly in the mud at low tide, gulls picking through seaweed, children daring each other to dash out further before the next wave comes in. All of them, in their own way, dancing to the same tune set by that glowing disc overhead. And here comes the third joke, soft as a yawn. If tides are the moon's way of flirting with Earth, then Earth is playing very hard to get. It keeps spinning away, forcing the oceans to chase after, like an awkward admirer. So tonight, as you let the fan hum and your eyelids droop, remember that even while you drift into dreams, The oceans are busy marching to a rhythm older than language. And if you wake up at some unholy hour, listen closely. The moon will still be there, tugging quietly, keeping time for the planet that refuses to sit still. Gravity doesn't shout. It doesn't strut into the room and declare itself the star of the show. It adds more like that quiet aunt at the family gathering, who doesn't say much but still manages to run the entire household. Without her, the roof would collapse, the oven wouldn't work, and the cat would be in charge. That's gravity. Invisible, modest, yet absolutely inescapable. I often think about it when I'm pouring tea at night. The liquid curves, clinging to the sides of the cup, always seeking the lowest point. And I catch myself thinking, what's really happening is the same rule that moves entire oceans. My teacup is a miniature planet, my spoon a makeshift moon. Stir it the right way, and for a moment, I feel like a cheap magician pretending to understand the cosmos. Here's the bit of old age wisdom for this round. Never fight what pulls you, learn how to steer with it. The fisherman who muttered that into my ear had lines on their face deep enough to store coins in. He meant the tides, of course, but the phrase sits comfortably in other corners of life. Resist gravity too hard, and you fall harder. Lean with it, and you glide. Now, for something completely irrelevant but entertaining. Octopuses have 3 hearts, and 2 of them stop beating when they swim. Imagine trying to run errands if 2/3 of your organs went on strike every time you jogged to catch the bus. No wonder they prefer lurking in tide pools, looking wise and mildly offended. Anyway, back to oceans. The moon S-pull is delicate, barely more than a whisper when measured in numbers. But water is a generous listener. It responds with those tidal bulges, rising just enough in the open sea to be a meter high. Doesn't sound dramatic, right? 1 meter. Until, that is, you funnel that bulge into a bay shaped like a megaphone, and suddenly the tide climbs 5, 6, even 15 meters. Gravity provides the rhythm. Geography supplies the amplifier. There is an academic debate I always find amusing. Is the moon really the main conductor of tides? Or is Earth's rotation the secret puppet master? Scholars with serious brows argue both sides, while the ocean frankly doesn't care. It just keeps lifting and falling, happy to let professors duel with chalk while waves lap at their feet. Sometimes I picture gravity as a set of invisible strings. The moon holds one end, Earth spins, and the water stretches like fabric being tugged in 2 directions. On one side, the oceans lean toward the moon, reaching out like someone craning for a hug. On the far side, inertia pushes the water outward as if to say, hang on, I was moving this way already. The result is 2 bulges, twin oceans breathing in synchrony with a rock in the sky. Joke time. If you've ever been late for work, just blame inertia. Sorry, boss, my body was resisting a change in motion. Works once, maybe twice, but after that you'll probably be changing motion right out the door. When I walk a beach at night, I sometimes stop and close my eyes. There's the hiss of water pulling back, the sudden clap as a wave folds over itself, and underneath it all, the feeling that something bigger is choreographing every step. It's humbling, really. We argue over politics and reality TV, while a stone orbiting above is literally dragging the oceans back and forth beneath our feet. Another quirky truth. If the moon were the size of a basketball and Earth the size of a beach ball, the 2 would be only a few meters apart in scale. Close enough for a casual game of catch, except one slip, and we're all extinct. It makes the calmness of the tides feel even more miraculous, an eternal balancing act with consequences far beyond soggy trainers on the shoreline. I like to imagine early humans standing at the edge of some ancient coast, staring at the sea as it crept forward, retreated and returned. They didn't have Newton or equations or even the word gravity, but they had eyes, and those eyes saw the moon above and the water below moving in tandem. For them, it wasn't an academic debate. It was a divine performance. And who can blame them for making up gods and myths to explain it? Third joke for tonight. I once told a friend that without gravity, we'd all be floating around, bumping into each other like balloons at a toddler's party. He said, "That doesn't sound so bad." I had to remind him, yes, but your fridge would too. And there's nothing poetic about chasing a floating fridge through the neighborhood. So I sit here, half drowsy, listening to the hum of the fan, and I feel the moon's pull in the most ordinary of ways, not as a shove, not as a command, but as a gentle reminder that none of us really move alone. The seas listen, the tides obey, and even my tea stirs in sympathy with the wider universe. Gravity is the most modest of companions, but also the one that never lets go. Picture Earth as a giant ball in space, wrapped in a shimmering cloak of water. The moon leans close, gives that cloak the faintest tug, and suddenly we've got bulges. Not glamorous bulges, no one's flexing abs here, but massive swells of seawater, rising toward the moon and, curiously, away from it as well. It's like squeezing a stress ball in the middle and watching both ends puff out. Only in this case, the stress ball is the entire planet. The idea of two ocean bulges still makes people wrinkle their brows. Sure, they say, I get why the water closest to the moon rises, but why does the far side bulge too? Isn't that the wrong direction? The answer, at least as I've convinced myself, lies in that balance between gravity and inertia. On the moon-facing side, gravity wins. On the far side, inertia, water's stubborn desire to keep going where it was going, takes over. The Earth itself gets pulled slightly more than the distant water, leaving that outer bulge trailing like an untucked shirt. An old fisherman once told me, the sea has two lungs, one for breathing in and one for sighing out. It was his poetic way of describing those twin bulges, and honestly, I prefer his version to Newton's equations. It makes you picture the whole planet breathing under the moon's watchful eye. Here's a quirky little fact to tuck away. If you took all the water displaced in a single tidal bulge, it would weigh trillions of tons. Yet in the open ocean, that bulge is only a meter high. It's like redistributing marbles across a football pitch, spread wide, but hardly noticeable until you're looking closely. Geography, of course, sharpens the effect, funneling that subtle swell into towering coastal tides. Now, the academic debate about this usually circles around one question. Should we describe tides as a gravitational effect, or as dynamic responses of a rotating fluid system? Which is a fancy way of saying, are the bulges simple, or are we overthinking it? Spoiler, it's complicated. Scientists love the word complicated. It justifies conferences in scenic cities. And since we're here, joke time. If Earth were really wrapped in a blanket, someone would already be selling official moon-certified tide-proof throws online. And yes, I would buy one, because who doesn't want their sofa to obey lunar cycles? But to feel the reality of twin bulges, you don't need science journals or overpriced blankets. You just need to stand on a shore and wait. Watch as the waterline creeps up the rocks, pauses, and then slides back, as though the ocean is uncertain whether to commit. Twice a day it lifts in honor of the moon's position, and twice a day it retreats in a slow bow. Another odd tidbit, even lakes feel the moon's pull, but they're too small to show much. Technically, yes, Lake Superior has tides. They're just a few centimeters, like the lake whispering, I'm trying, okay? Oceans get all the applause because they've got the mass to make it dramatic. If I squint at the whole picture, the twin bulges remind me of two opposing drumbeats, steady and inevitable. The Earth spins beneath them, sliding coastlines through these watery swells, so we feel their rhythm as high tide and low tide. It's less like sloshing soup in a bowl and more like an enormous planetary metronome. The third joke tonight. If the oceans are bulging toward and away from the moon, technically Earth is wearing water shoulder pads, which means, for a brief moment each day, our planet looks like it's auditioning for an 80s rock band. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I imagine floating just above Earth, looking down on the oceans puffed out in those two places, while continents drift beneath them. The thought is oddly soothing. The tides are less chaotic than they feel from the beach. They're a system, ancient and predictable. You can almost hear the steady inhalation, the slow exhalation, a rhythm older than memory itself. And that rhythm carries us quietly into the next part of the story, where Earth's spin complicates everything further, dragging coastlines under bulges like passengers on a cosmic conveyor belt. If you've ever stood on an airport conveyor belt, half amused and half terrified, it might suddenly fling you into someone's luggage. You already have a good metaphor for tides. The bulges of water caused by the moon are more or less fixed in position relative to the moon itself. But the Earth, being a restless ball, spins underneath them. Every 24 hours, a coastline moves into one bulge, then into the other, and voila, 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a day. Like clockwork. Or rather, like conveyor work. Now here's the kicker. The moon doesn't sit still either. It's orbiting Earth, shifting slightly each day, so that neat cycle doesn't reset every 24 hours. Instead, high tide arrives roughly 50 minutes later each day. If you've ever wondered why your beach picnic got unexpectedly soaked despite having timed it right yesterday, blame the moon's slow wanderings. It's fashionably late every single day. I remember a salty old dock worker telling me, "The sea never keeps your schedule. You keep hers." A nugget of old age wisdom if I've ever heard one. He was right. Tides are not bound to our clocks. They answer only to the turning of Earth and the position of the moon. Here's a quirky fact for dessert. In some places, like the Gulf of Mexico, there's only 1 high tide and 1 low tide each day. Scientists call it a diurnal tide, which sounds like something you'd order at a trendy cafe. I'll have 1 flat white and a diurnal tide, please. Geography, again, gets the final say. Now, an academic debate worth mentioning. Should we think of tides as static bulges dragged under coastlines, or as waves propagating across the planet? Scholars love this question because it makes tides sound like rock concerts, standing waves, resonances, amplifications. Either way, what matters to you and me is whether our beach towel stays dry. Joke number 1. I once explained this whole conveyor belt idea to a friend. She said, "So Earth spins and the moon just waits with buckets of water to dump on us." Technically wrong, but a pretty fun mental image. Walking along a harbour, you can see this conveyor belt in action. Boats lean awkwardly against the mud at low tide, then float gracefully again as the water returns. The entire dock rises and falls, as if the ground beneath were breathing. It's hypnotic, if you let yourself stand there long enough. The conveyor never stops. It just keeps moving, dragging coastlines under those invisible bulges day and night. Another quirky fact. The time between one high tide and the next isn't exactly 12 hours. It's more like 12 hours and 25 minutes. That's because the moon insists on drifting forward in its orbit while Earth spins. So, yes, you can set your watch by the tides, but you'll need to build in the moon's little vanity delay. Joke number 2. If Earth's rotation is the conveyor belt, then humans are the awkward baggage riding it. Except instead of arriving at baggage claim, we end up at work, which is less fun and more expensive. What I love most about this conveyor belt rhythm is its reliability. Despite storms, earthquakes, or whatever chaos we invent as humans, the tide remains faithful. You know where it will be tomorrow, and next week, and even centuries from now. Mariners used this rhythm long before mechanical clocks, and to be honest, the ocean's clock is the more trustworthy one. But of course, not every coast dances the same routine. Some experience mixed tides, where the 2 daily highs are unequal. San Diego, for example, gets 1 impressive high tide, and 1 rather underwhelming one. It asks like Earth serving you a double espresso in the morning and a lukewarm tea at night. Again, geography is the unruly DJ remixing the moon's steady beat. Third joke before we wrap this part. If tides are like a conveyor belt, then Earth's continents are the items in duty-free. Always overpriced, slightly awkward, but somehow still irresistible. The conveyor keeps moving. Every shoreline, from jagged cliffs to sandy coves, takes its turn under the bulges. Twice a day, like breathing. Twice a day, like a heartbeat. You and I are passengers on this endless ride, carried forward whether we notice or not. And the ride only grows more interesting once the sun steps in and decides it wants to dance too. Just when you think the moon has the oceans all to itself, along comes the sun, humming a different tune. And because it's about 27 million times more massive than the moon, you'd expect it to boss the tides around completely. But distance ruins its swagger. At 150 million kilometers away, the sun's gravitational influence on tides is only about half of the moon's. Close neighbors always win arguments. Still, the sun plays an important supporting role, and when the sun and moon line up, the tides go dramatic. We call these spring tides, though they have nothing to do with the season. The word comes from the idea of tides springing forth, stretching higher and lower than usual. During a spring tide, beaches shrink, harbors deepen, and the sea seems to exhale with all its might. Old age wisdom moment. I once heard an islander in Brittany say, "If the full moon catches you napping, you'll wake up wet." His point: never underestimate spring tides. They can swallow a car park if you're careless. And yes, more than one unfortunate tourist has learned that lesson the hard way. On the flip side, when the sun and moon pull at right angles, you get neap tides. The name isn't glamorous, it sounds like a brand of socks, but the effect is clear. The tides flatten. High water isn't so high, low water isn't so low, and the sea seems to shrug instead of heave. Here's a quirky fact. Oysters spawn in rhythm with spring tides, as though they're reading lunar calendars. Coastal communities once scheduled oyster feasts not by the clock, but by the shape of the moon. Imagine explaining that to someone from inland. Dinner's cancelled. The moon's not right. Now, for the academic debate of the evening. Do we think of spring and neap tides as purely additive forces, sun plus moon equals big splash? Or should we consider the complex interference patterns with resonance and angular displacement included? I've read enough papers to know the argument will outlive me. Joke 1. I once told someone neap tides were named after someone taking a nap during measurements. They believed me for a full 5 minutes. Bless them. The pattern is reliable. About every 2 weeks, the world swings between spring and neap tides. Fishermen time their nets for spring tides, when fish move with the stronger flows. Coastal foragers wait for neaps, when flats are exposed longer and safer to cross. Even modern shipping companies quietly adjust schedules, because fuel efficiency still bows to celestial geometry. Another quirky fact. The word neap comes from an Old English root meaning scanty, which is exactly how the sea behaves, stingy with its highs and its lows. Language, like water, carries the memory of old rhythms. Joke 2. Imagine the sun and moon arguing like siblings. The sun says, "Let's pull this way." The moon insists, "No, this way." And Earth, stuck in the middle, sighs, "Fine, I'll just slosh a little." Cosmic family drama, acted out in salt water. There's something profoundly humbling about standing on a shore during a spring tide, watching the water climb further than it should, then drain away to reveal sandbanks no one usually sees. It's not just scenery, it's the geometry of the heavens sketched onto Earth. Ancient astronomers noticed it long before we had words like gravity. To them, the sky and sea were siblings talking. Joke 3, before I drift too far. If tides are a duet between the sun and moon, then Earth is the drummer keeping time, and occasionally missing a beat. So while the moon leads the rhythm, the sun adds harmony. Together they make sure the sea never performs the same way twice. Sometimes bold, sometimes restrained, always moving to the hidden score written in light and distance. The tide, as it turns out, is not a solo performance, but a duet, and we are the lucky audience at the edge of the stage. If the moon provides the beat and the sun adds a harmony, then the oceans themselves are the instruments, and like any instrument, each one has its quirks. Some sing with a deep, booming voice. Others mumble under their breath. The same gravitational pull can sound like a thunderous drum roll in one bay and barely a whisper in another. I remember leaning over a map with an old sailor who jabbed at it with his pipe. "Here," he said, tapping the Bay of Fundy. "The sea climbs higher than a church tower." He wasn't exaggerating. That long, funnel-shaped bay between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick has the highest tidal range in the world, over 15 meters on a good day. That's taller than a 5-story building, all courtesy of resonance. Each incoming surge matches the natural rhythm of the bay, like a swing pushed at just the right moment. The result is water piling up until it feels as though the whole ocean has decided to show off. Old age wisdom for you. Never build your house where the sea sings loudest. Generations in Fundy took that to heart. It's why their houses perch on high ground, watching the tide roar in below. Quirky fact. At the other extreme, the Mediterranean barely shrugs at the moon's pull. Its tides are only a few centimeters. Blink and you'll miss them. It's so near landlocked that the tidal bulges can't really get in, like an uninvited guest turned away at the door. Academic debate here. Is geography the true sculptor of tidal variety, or just an amplifier of celestial forces? Some argue it's all in the resonance, the perfect matching of basin length and tidal period. Others say local shelves and seabeds complicate things beyond neat models. Either way, the Earth's S-shape makes sure the same moon, S-pull, produces 1,000 different local stories. Joke 1. If oceans are instruments, the Bay of Fundy is a tuba, the Mediterranean is a kazoo, and somewhere out there is a triangle being played very politely. It's not just big seas that show personality. Narrow rivers sometimes throw tidal bores, walls of water rushing inland against the current. The Severn River in England does it, thundering upstream with enough force to carry adventurous surfers. China's Chantang River has one too, a monster called the Silver Dragon, roaring over 9 meters high. These events are part science, part spectacle, and entirely proof that geography loves a bit of drama. Another quirky fact. Amphidromic points exist, spots in the middle of oceans where the tide doesn't rise or fall at all. Around them, the water circles like a lazy whirlpool. Stand there and you'd never know tides exist, while a few 100 kilometers away, the sea is surging in and out like a restless sleeper. Joke 2. If I ever stumble into an amphidromic point, I'll pitch a deck chair and brag, "Look, I've tamed the tides." Of course, no one will believe me, and my crisps will still go soggy. The English Channel magnifies tides too, funneling water into dramatic rises. Ports like Saint-Malo in France are designed with high walls to keep ships afloat at low tide. Otherwise they'd sit on mud like stranded whales. Across the world, Alaska's fjords squeeze the sea so tightly that tides leap up 10 meters or more, turning placid bays into tidal roller coasters. Quirky fact number 3. The Gulf of Mexico, despite being large, has tides of less than half a meter. It's like the ocean yawning instead of singing. Geography again. Its rounded basin doesn't resonate with the moon's timing, so the sea just shrugs politely. Joke 3. If seas are instruments, the Gulf of Mexico is the guy at the back of the band pretending to play the cymbals, barely moving his arms, but still taking credit. So, geography ensures no tide is quite like another. The moon provides the pull, but bays, shelves and channels decide how loudly to answer. Stand on a cliff above a roaring tidal channel, or sit on a calm Mediterranean beach, and you'll find it hard to believe they're bowing to the same moon. The difference lies in the contours underfoot, the shape of the water's stage. When the tide slides back and leaves that strip of rocks and sand uncovered, you step into one of the strangest neighborhoods on Earth. The intertidal zone isn't really land, and it isn't really sea. It's both, and neither, and somehow alive in ways that make you feel like a trespasser. Every rock pool is its own tiny kingdom. Peer in and you'll find anemones waving their arms like bored ballerinas, crabs scuttling sideways with more attitude than pedestrians in London, and starfish glued to stones as though they've decided, "This is my sofa now." I once crouched beside a tide pool at dusk, watching a barnacle flick out its feathery limbs to catch dinner. The thing looked like a little window opening and shutting. Old age wisdom struck me right then. Patience feeds you. The barnacle wasn't rushing, wasn't chasing, just waiting for the sea to bring the buffet. A lesson in living slowly, if ever there was one. Here's your quirky fact. Mussels attach themselves to rocks, with threads stronger than steel relative to their size. Engineers have studied them to design glues that work underwater. Imagine living in a house that clings tighter the wetter it gets. Pretty handy in a storm. Of course, life here is brutal in its own way. One moment you're swimming, the next, you're baking in the midday sun. Water evaporates, pools heat up, salinity spikes. It's like moving house twice a day, every day. The creatures that survive here have tricks up their sleeves, shells that snap shut, skins that hold moisture, habits that scream resilience. An academic debate surfaces here too. Did life first crawl onto land through these tidal zones? Some biologists argue yes, that the push and pull of water created the pressure to adapt lungs, limbs, and stubbornness. Others counter that freshwater swamps were the cradle. Either way, the tide pools we see today are like evolutionary museums, still displaying the art of adaptation. Joke 1. I once told a kid that sea anemones are just flowers that got tired of photosynthesis and decided to try fishing. He nodded solemnly and said, "Makes sense." Somewhere, his biology teacher is still recovering. Barnacles, mussels, crabs, they all build communities, layering themselves like crowded flats. They trap moisture, share shade, and create miniature cities in the splash zone. Even their predators are patient. Sea stars creep on their tiny suction feet, prying muscles open not with brute force, but with unshakable persistence. And when they succeed, they literally push their stomachs into the shell to digest dinner on the spot. Terrifying if you picture it at human scale. Fascinating when you see it in slow motion. Quirky fact number 2. Some tidepool fish, like blennies, can hop across wet rocks, holding their breath just long enough to find the next puddle. They're like little parkour athletes with fins. If you've ever tripped on a wet rock, imagine a fish smirking at you while it nails the landing. Joke 2. If starfish could talk, I'm convinced they'd have the laziest voices. "Oh, hey, just gonna flip my stomach out here for a bit. Don't mind me." What strikes me most about tide pools is their stubbornness. Everything in them says change is inevitable, but so is survival. The tide rolls in, creatures open up and feed. The tide rolls out, they close shop and wait, rinse, repeat, forever. It's a rhythm written by the moon, etched into claws and shells, lived out by beings that don't know they're following celestial orders. Another quirky fact, some intertidal snails can literally hibernate during hot spells, sealing themselves off with a tiny door of shell called an operculum. It's like pulling the shutters down when the landlord, in this case, the sun, gets too nosy. Joke 3. If I were a barnacle, I'd probably invent an app called Tide Talk, 15-second clips of waves, crab fights, and occasional starfish drama. I'd make a fortune in plankton. The intertidal zone is raw survival, but it's also a reminder of how life thrives in the cracks. Stand on the rocks, look down, and you'll see resilience written in tiny movements. Creatures open, close, creep, snap, and sway, all because the moon tells them the water is leaving, then returning. They don't argue, they adapt, and in their stubborn little world, they make chaos look like choreography. Long before satellites or chalkboards full of equations, people stood on beaches, scratched their heads and said, "This has to mean something." The ocean didn't just rise and fall at random. It seemed to listen to the sky. And so, as humans always do, they told stories. If you don't have physics, you invent gods. In Mesopotamia, the moon was a deity called Sin, ruling over fertility and cycles. When rivers swelled, it was Sin keeping the world on schedule. The Greeks, of course, had Poseidon to stir the waters, but they also linked the tides to Artemis and Selene, weaving the moon directly into the sea's moods. Old age wisdom fact. One Greek philosopher, Pythias, actually noticed that tides were higher at full and new moons. For someone wandering around in the 4th century BCE, that was a pretty sharp observation. He didn't know why, but he knew enough to nod respectfully at the heavens. Quirky fact. Norse mythology had Ran, a sea giantess with a net who dragged sailors beneath the waves. Imagine being a Viking and explaining to your family, "Sorry, tide's not right for the raid. Ran's in a bad mood." The academic debate in this era was simple but fierce. Were the tides controlled by gods directly, or were the gods simply using the moon as their tool? It's a debate that makes modern scientists smirk, but honestly, who are we to laugh? They saw the same patterns we do. They just described them with better storytelling. Joke 1. I once told a friend that the Maori believed the moon fished the tides with a giant rod. He said, "Really?" I had to admit I'd made that one up. But give it time. Someone will probably adopt it into folklore. Chinese traditions linked the moon to feminine energy and water, balancing yin and yang. In Hindu mythology, the moon was Soma, both a deity and an elixir of life, regulating not just tides, but fertility and time itself. Everywhere you look, people found meaning in the moon's steady watch. You didn't need mathematics to know that its glow mattered. Another quirky fact: Polynesian navigators, some of the finest sailors in history, didn't just watch the stars. They read the moon and tides, knowing exactly when lagoons would fill or drain. Their survival depended on it. They didn't call it astronomy. They called it Tuesday. Joke 2. If Poseidon really was in charge of tides, I bet he'd get grumpy about modern shipping schedules. Sorry lads, your cargo's late because I fancied a stronger ebb this morning. I love how universal this was. Cultures, oceans apart. Japan, Greece, Polynesia, the Pacific Northwest. Each wove the moon and tides into myth. They might disagree on which deity was tugging the strings, but they all agreed the moon had something to say. That's remarkable consistency for people who never compared notes. Old sayings often survive the longest, and in this case they all share the same undercurrent. Trust the rhythm of the sea, because the moon won't betray it. That idea isn't outdated, it's still wisdom today. Another quirky gem: the word lunatic comes from the belief that the moon influenced madness. People thought full moons made tempers flare and reason slip away, which, if you've ever worked retail on a Friday night, seems oddly accurate. Joke 3. I once told someone that werewolves are just the moon's way of announcing, "Spring tide's coming." They rolled their eyes, but I still think it explains a lot. Standing on a beach centuries ago, watching the water creep forward and retreat, people must have felt both awe and terror. The sea could feed you or drown you, and the moon was its visible signal. Myths were their way of keeping order. And though we've replaced gods with gravity, the wonder hasn't gone anywhere. The moon still tugs, the water still obeys, and our stories, whether divine or scientific, are just ways of saying, we noticed. If myths gave the moon a personality, the calendar gave it a job. Long before anyone worried about leap years or daylight savings, people looked up and counted nights. 1 new moon, 2 new moons, 3 new moons. That's a season. That's how early farmers knew when to plant and when to harvest. The word month itself comes from moon, a reminder of how deeply that silver disk shaped our sense of time. I imagine some ancient villager watching the tide creep in, scratching lines into a stick to mark the days. Old age wisdom fact: Babylonian priests tracked the moon with astonishing accuracy, creating calendars that lined up not just with the sky, but with tidal behavior along the Persian Gulf. You don't need quartz watches when you've got the heavens ticking overhead. Quirky fact: the Romans tried to tidy things up by forcing months into their own system. That was why February got stuck with 28 days. It was the leftover drawer where they shoved the spare parts. Not exactly lunar elegance, but bureaucrats will be bureaucrats. The academic debate: whether early calendars were driven more by agriculture or by ritual. Did farmers demand timekeeping to track planting cycles, or did priests demand it to schedule ceremonies? Scholars still argue, while the moon, unbothered, keeps rising on schedule. Joke 1. Imagine explaining daylight savings to an ancient farmer. Twice a year, we all agree to lie to our clocks. He'd probably reply, "Or you could just look at the moon, mate." Fishing villages, especially, clung to lunar time. A full moon meant stronger tides, better catches, and riskier voyages. Folktales often warned against ignoring the moon's guidance. Sail at neap tide, they'd say, if you value your boat more than your bravery. The sea was a larder and a grave, and the moon was its lock and key. Another quirky gem. The word lunisolar describes calendars that juggle both moon and sun cycles. The Hebrew, Islamic, and Chinese calendars still carry echoes of this balancing act. It's like humanity couldn't choose which celestial neighbor to trust, so we picked both. Joke 2. If the moon invented the calendar, then surely Mondays are its fault, which explains the global sigh every time the week begins. Festivals blossomed from this rhythm. Harvest moons, mid-autumn celebrations, lunar New Year's, each tied to a cycle of light and tide. Even today, farmers check the moon for planting advice, though now it's more tradition than science. Still, it's hard to resist a bright harvest moon rising over fields, turning work into poetry. Another quirky fact. The phrase, once in a blue moon, isn't tea about colour but rarity, when 2 full moons fall in the same month. Farmers used it as shorthand, not cosmic mystery. Still, standing under one, you can't help feeling the sky is playing tricks. Joke 3. If you ever want to confuse someone, tell them the moon actually has 13 cycles a year, not 12. Watch them panic about missing a secret month. Quick, what do we call it? Smarch. So the moon didn't just light the night, it carved the year. It set rhythms for fishing, planting, worship, and feasting. Even as modern life runs on digital calendars and phone alarms, the old connection remains. Every time we say month, we are whispering an ancient truth. We still measure our lives by a rock in the sky. It's one thing to admire tides from the shore, but another to harness them for survival. Harbours, trade routes, and wars have all been won or lost because someone understood when the sea would rise. The moon wasn't just a clock in the sky. It was the invisible ally or enemy of every sailor who ever touched an oar. Take the Thames, for example. London exists where it does because the river swells just enough to bring ships inland, but not so violently as to swallow the docks. Old age wisdom. Fact. A city grows only where ships can pause without fear. Harbours aren't accidents, they're tidal bargains. Quirky fact. Venice doesn't really have tides in the same way the Atlantic does. Its lagoon feels only faint lunar nudges. But when winds and high waters align, the city floods. Locals call it aqua alta. It's not a tide so much as a salty prank played by geography. Now for the academic debate, did tides dictate the shape of empires, or did human ingenuity simply learn to adapt to them? Historians argue endlessly, but it's hard to deny that the British Empire's naval dominance had as much to do with knowing the tide tables as it did with cannon fire. Joke 1. Imagine trying to launch an invasion at low tide and watching your ships sit stubbornly in the mud. Some generals did exactly that, though I won't name names. History has enough embarrassment already. The D-Day landings in Normandy are a textbook example of moonlit calculation. Planners needed just the right moment. A low tide at dawn to expose German obstacles, paired with a full moon to guide the night approach. Get it wrong, and history would read very differently. The moon, in its quiet way, tipped the scales of the 20th century. Another quirky gem. The port of Mont-Saint-Michel in France once had tides so treacherous that locals said they moved as fast as a galloping horse. Pilgrims who underestimated it often learned the hard way that the sea is faster than faith. Joke 2. If I'd been in charge of ancient naval strategy, my only advice would have been, wait until the moon says go. Probably would have saved a few ships from embarrassment and sunk my career as a bold commander. Trade, too, depended on tidal knowledge. The Dutch Golden Age was fueled not only by ships and spices, but by a mastery of shallow tidal estuaries. Without tide-savvy pilots, Amsterdam would have been just another marshy outpost. And across the world, Arab navigators timed their dhows to Indian Ocean monsoon winds and tidal flows, creating a maritime superhighway centuries before GPS. Another quirky fact. In some medieval towns, tidal mills harnessed the rise and fall of the sea to grind grain. Long before we plugged turbines into tidal currents, people were already milking the moon for energy, albeit for bread, not electricity. Joke 3. If history teachers framed empires as those who read the moon correctly versus those who didn't at tea, students might actually stay awake in class. It amazes me that something as gentle as the moon at S-pull could decide the fate of fleets, ports, and kingdoms. But that's exactly what happened. The greatest ships, the grandest ambitions, they all bent to the same rhythm that moves barnacles and starfish. Tides don't care if you're an emperor or a fisherman. They rise, they fall, and they wait to see whether you've learned to listen. It's one thing to notice the tide, and another to measure it. Humans, being compulsive note-takers, couldn't resist. Early on, it was simple. Scratch marks on piers, stones set along rivers, stories whispered from old mouths to young. But soon, the urge for precision took hold. After all, trade, farming, and survival depend on knowing exactly when the sea will come to claim the shore. Old age wisdom here. Write down what the sea tells you, or you'll forget when you need it most. Fishermen in Brittany kept little journals, not of gossip or prayer, but of tides. The moon was their boss, and they clocked in daily. Quirky fact: the world's oldest known tide mill in Northern Ireland dates back to the 7th century. Imagine monks grinding flour powered by the moon's pull. A holy loaf, indeed. The academic debate starts properly with Newton. His theory of gravitation gave tides a framework. The moon pulls, the earth responds. Yet even after Newton, the equations were messy. Pierre-Simon Laplace and William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, spent lifetimes refining tide prediction machines. Some of these devices looked like brass spaghetti, cogs, pulleys, chains, all built to mimic the sea's rhythm. Scientists still argue whether mechanical tide calculators represent genius or madness. Maybe both. Joke 1. I'd pay good money for a pocket-sized tide-predicting gadget, like a Tamagotchi that just beeps, high tide in 2 hours, beats losing your shoes to the surf. By the 19th century, proper tide tables appeared, pages of numbers neatly printed for sailors and harbours. The British Admiralty published some of the earliest, and suddenly the moon's secrets weren't whispered by sailors, but printed in tidy rows, accessible to anyone who could read. Knowledge, like water, was spreading. Another quirky fact: tide tables were once guarded like treasure. Shipping companies wouldn't share them with rivals, knowing full well that whoever mastered the tides mastered trade routes. The moon had become intellectual property. Joke 2. Imagine trying to pirate tide tables. Hand over your almanac or we'll board. A very nerdy kind of piracy. Today, satellites track sea levels to millimeters. Computers model tides years in advance. You can download an app that tells you exactly when the sand will show at your favorite beach. It's staggering how far we've come from scratching lines on wood. And yet, despite all the tech, mistakes happen. Predictions get fuzzy when you mix in storms, wind, or the quirks of local geography. No model is perfect. Even the most modern satellites sometimes shrug and say, close enough. The ocean has a sense of humor, and it doesn't share all its secrets. Quirky fact number 3. In 1954, a US Coast Guard station still used a mechanical tide predicting machine from the 1920s, a monster of cranks and wheels. It worked so reliably that they refused to replace it. Why fix what isn't broken? Joke 3. If my phone app fails me and I get drenched, I'll start carrying a brass tide machine in a backpack. Heavy, yes, but undeniably stylish. From scratches on docks to satellites in orbit, the story is the same. Humans can't resist counting. The sea rises, the sea falls, and we jot it down. Maybe it's control we're after, or maybe it's comfort. The feeling that if we measure enough, we'll never be surprised. But the truth is, the tide will always have the last laugh. We can predict, but never command. There's always been a dream of turning the moon's pull into power. If tides are going to rise and fall no matter what, why not make them pay rent? The idea isn't new. Remember those medieval tide mills grinding grain? But in the modern world, engineers took the thought further. Could the tide light our homes, run our factories, and charge our phones? The first big leap was tidal barrages, massive dams across estuaries. When the tide flows in, gates open, water fills a basin. When it flows out, turbines spin, and voila, electricity straight from the moon's pull. Old age wisdom fact: don't block the river unless you're ready to pay its price. Communities near early barrages learned that lesson quickly. Altering tidal flow changes fish patterns, mudflats, even whole ecosystems. Quirky fact: France has run a tidal power station at La Rance since 1966. It still operates today, quietly pumping electricity from the ocean's breath. Tourists sometimes visit without realizing they're standing on a machine that runs on moonlight indirectly. The academic debate is fierce here. Tidal power is predictable, unlike wind or solar. But is it truly green? It doesn't release smoke, but it does reshape estuaries, uproot habitats, and confuse fish that followed tidal rhythms long before we built turbines. Scholars call it the paradox of predictable sustainability. Try saying that 3 times fast. Joke 1. If you ever want to feel powerful, just say, "Yeah, I harness the moon to charge my phone." Makes you sound like a wizard with a data plan. Newer technologies aim to be gentler. Instead of barrages, they drop underwater turbines into tidal streams, like windmills under the sea. No giant dams, just blades spinning with the flow. These devices look sleek, almost science fiction, yet face the same problems: maintenance, cost, and curious seals trying to bite the machinery. Another quirky gem. In Scotland's Orkney Islands, tidal turbines are tested in some of the fastest waters in Europe. Locals joke that if you drop your spanner overboard, it'll be in Norway by lunchtime. Joke 2. Imagine explaining to the moon, "Hey, thanks for the electricity." The moon would probably roll its craters and say, "I was just pulling the ocean." But sure, take credit. Some dreamers go bigger still. Floating tidal farms, arrays of turbines like underwater solar panels. Others imagine pumping tidal water uphill into reservoirs, storing its power like bottled lightning. The creativity is endless, but so are the costs. The sea is a rough landlord. Machinery rusts, storms smash, barnacles cling. Nothing stays shiny under salt water for long. Quirky fact number 3. Engineers once tried coating turbines with sharkskin-like textures to stop barnacles sticking. It worked for a while, until the barnacles evolved a taste for sharkskin. Nature always wins. Joke 3. If barnacles ever unionize, tidal power will end overnight. Sorry humans, no electricity until we negotiate better rocks. Still, the dream persists. Unlike oil, tides won't run out. Unlike sunlight, they won't hide behind clouds. Unlike wind, they don't get shy. Twice a day, every day, they move with clockwork grace. If we can master the technology without wrecking coastlines, tidal energy might be one of the cleanest deals humanity ever makes with nature. For now, though, we're still tinkering, building, breaking, and learning. The moon tugs, the water flows, and humanity, ever ambitious, tries to catch lightning in a tide pool. Most tides roll in with a shrug, but some arrive like they've had too much coffee. Around the world, you find rare places where the sea decides to show off, turning ordinary rhythm into spectacle. These extremes and oddities remind us that the ocean, though predictable, still has a wild streak. Take tidal bores, for instance. Imagine standing beside a river, expecting the usual gentle trickle, when suddenly a wall of water charges upstream like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. The Severn Bore in England does exactly that, thundering inland with a wave tall enough for surfers to ride. Old age wisdom, locals say, don't stand too close when the bore comes, unless you want the river to borrow your boots. Quirky fact, the Qiantang River in China has the biggest bore in the world, nicknamed the Silver Dragon. It can roar up to 9 meters high, smashing against banks with the force of a freight train. Festivals are held to watch it. though authorities constantly remind people that dragons don't care if you've brought a camera. Academic debate here focuses on terminology. Is a tidal bore a true wave, or is it a hydraulic jump, a sudden change in flow dynamics? Scientists argue while surfers simply shout, "Cowabunga," and paddle harder. Joke 1. I once told someone the silver dragon was just China's way of washing the river once a month. They nodded. I think they were only half joking. Then there are whirlpools. Natural maelstroms born of fast-moving tides through narrow straits. The Corrie Vrecken off Scotland is so fierce it was once declared unnavigable by the Royal Navy. Legend has it, a king tested a man's courage by tying him to a boat and sending him into the whirlpool. He survived, which makes me think either the king was cruel or very bored. Another quirky gem. Norway has the Saltstraumen, the world's strongest tidal current. Every 6 hours, 400 million cubic meters of water rush through a narrow sound. That's like emptying an Olympic swimming pool every second. Fishermen love it, but their boats groan like pensioners every time they fight the current. Joke 2. If you ever find yourself in a whirlpool, just remember, it's basically the ocean giving itself a spin cycle. Hopefully you come out slightly cleaner. Not all extremes are dramatic. Some seas barely notice the moon at all. In the Mediterranean, tides measure in mere centimeters. Locals shrug and say, "Tide? What tide?" Contrast that with the Bay of Fundy in Canada, where the tide can leap higher than a 4-story building. Same moon, wildly different results. Quirky fact number 3. In certain Pacific atolls, people once believed the tide was controlled by giant clams opening and shutting on the seabed, which, honestly, is more fun than Laplace's equations. Joke 3. If giant clams really did run the tides, they'd probably charge rent for beach space. Sorry, sir, your towel is in our jurisdiction. These extremes prove that the moon's pull isn't a uniform script. Geography and geology edit the performance, adding drama, muting it, or sometimes throwing in a dragon-shaped encore. The result is a planet where no two coasts tell the same tidal story. And for every calm Mediterranean beach, there's a river somewhere preparing to roar upstream and remind us that the sea, for all its predictability, still has surprises tucked in its waves. For all the grand talk of whirlpools and dragon bores, most of us meet the tide in quieter ways. It slips into our daily lives, subtle as background music. Walk along a pier, and you notice boats tilting at odd angles, ropes creaking as the water rises beneath them. Wander down to the beach with a picnic, and suddenly your blanket is a meter from the surf because you forgot the sea is on a schedule of its own. Old age wisdom comes in handy here. Never turn your back on the sea. A Cornish fisherman told me that, his voice as rough as driftwood. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. People distracted by sandcastles or selfies have been surprised by incoming tides more times than he cared to count. The ocean doesn't negotiate. It just shows up. Here is a quirky fact. Some coastal communities still set their church clocks to the tide instead of the hour. Services begin when the tide allows boats to dock. Imagine telling your boss, "Sorry, I'll be in after the neap tide." It sounds like an excuse, but in some places, it's real life. An academic debate crops up even in daily life. Do tides still matter in the age of motorboats, highways, and planes? Some argue we've outgrown them. Others insist they shape far more than we notice. Fish migrations, beach erosion, even groundwater levels. I'm with the latter camp. Just because you can see the strings doesn't mean the puppet's not dancing. Joke 1. I once blamed being late to a dinner party on the tide. Sorry, couldn't cross the living room, it was high tide. No one laughed, but I stand by it. For many people, tides still dictate dinner. Mussel gatherers, clam diggers, crabbers, they all wait for the moon's signal. The best beds reveal themselves only when the water slides back, giving just a narrow window to harvest. Get it wrong, and you either go home empty-handed or risk a race against a surging tide. Another quirky fact. Surfers often joke that the tide decides. A perfect wave at high tide can turn into a mushy mess at low, and vice versa. Surf reports list tide times alongside wave height and wind. You'd think surfers just lounged in the sun, but in truth, they're amateur oceanographers with very stylish wetsuits. Joke 2. Once, a surfer told me the moon is basically his manager. She sets my shifts. Honestly, that's the best job description I've ever heard. Even away from beaches, tides slip into our metaphors. Politicians talk of the tide of change. Friends console you with, "This too shall pass," like the tide. The language of rise and fall is stitched into our conversations, proof that we still sense the moon's whisper in our bones. Another quirky gem. In Japanese poetry, tides are often used to describe fleeting love, something that arrives, lingers, and inevitably retreats. You can't hold it, but you can marvel while it's there. Romantic, if a little salty. Joke 3. I once tried to use "sorry, it's low tide" as an excuse for not replying to texts. Didn't work. Apparently, tides don't control messaging apps. Yet. So yes, even in a world of planes and apps, the tide still shapes daily life. It sneaks into our meals, our metaphors, our moods. It pulls at boats, bends our schedules, dictates our hobbies. We may not always notice, but twice a day, the moon reminds us who's really in charge. And we keep obeying, whether we admit it or not.